right, guys, we have another diagnostic video for you today. Let's take a look at what we've got. This is a 2005 Ford Freestyle. I am pretty sure that this car has been in a previous video. I don't remember which one though, but we've got a new symptom that the owner says developed last week, and the woman's husband is pretty sure that it's a bad fuel pump. They actually asked me to quote and look at replacing the fuel pump, but of course they know that before we do that, I'm gonna check and make sure that that actually is the problem. And the reason that the gentleman believes that it's a bad fuel pump is because he says the car lacks severe power. When you hit the gas pedal, it just doesn't seem to want to get out of its own way. There is also check engine light on, but they didn't look at what it was, and they're figuring that it's a fuel issue. I pulled the car into the garage myself. I can tell you, to me, it feels like a misfire, but we do have a constant check engine light on, not a flashing one. But it does feel to me like a misfire. It definitely, you can feel it struggling when you hit the gas pedal, no question about it. And it idles pretty rough when it's in drive as well. So I think we'll start off, let's put the scan tool on it and see what codes we find on that check engine light. Got the car idling while we get our top-down, what is it, the Phoenix Smart that I've got a review on. Let's go to the auto scan. I can tell you while the car is idling, this is definitely a misfire. There's no question. Oh, look, the parts lottery is being played. It's the parts slot machine. And while that goes, you won't be able to hear it through the camera, unfortunately. But let's see, we got a Ford here. There is an occasional, like I would say every 2 or 3 seconds, there will be a miss. And then I can tell you, when you put the car in drive, it idles very rough. You really get a lot of vibration. All right, let's get this loaded up and let's check that check engine light code. All right, again, this topology thing is just absolutely awesome. We can see we've got PCM on the high-speed CAN network, so if we had any network issues or anything, we know right where to go and what modules may contain our terminating resistors and everything like that. Just such a cool feature. Autel has this too, of course, but I love that topology. All right, let's just read the fault code. And the top-down, again, like I mentioned in my review of it, we've got a lot of special features here. This will just retrieve our codes here, but the other two are basically self-tests where it will run through operating a lot of the sensors, solenoids, things like that. And we can see our issue right here. We've got, definitely it is a misfire, a P0301. We also have a P0316. What this is basically a startup misfire. That can often be helpful in detecting if you've got like a cold start misfire specifically or something like that. But the fact that this engine is warmed up, and I can tell you for a fact right now, I can feel there are misfires. We're gonna just chase this P0301 knowing it'll also fix the 0316 as well. So let's go back here, see if there's a misfire counter just out of curiosity. Well, it's a Ford, it's gonna have a misfire counter. And as a matter of fact, we can do kind of I'll show you something new, guys, that some of you guys may not be familiar with for the Fords. I'm not sure where this will be, probably special functions, relative. So power balance is actually what I had in mind here. This kind of also can work as a misfire counter. So let's choose the power balance. And what this is gonna do is basically it's going to show the equivalence of the cylinder contributions as measured by crankshaft speed. Now, as we can see right now, everything's pretty equal. We've got no misfires here. And oddly, now the car actually is not misfiring. I'm not too worried about that though, because we're gonna be able to make it misfire pretty easily if I put this car in drive. Okay, yeah, right now it's idling absolutely perfectly. I don't know why the misfires decided to stop as soon as I hooked up the scan tool. That's the way it goes, but what we're gonna do is put this car in drive here, and it is idling really bad. And here we see our issue here. Basically what this is, cylinder 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we see cylinder number 1 is stacking up misfires here. We can clear that and start the counter over again. And we can see it's a misfire pretty much every single engine revolution here. And only that cylinder has the misfires. So what this is actually doing is it's looking at the crankshaft rotation speed, and it's seeing there's a slower speed associated with the crankshaft after the cylinder number 1 should fire. So it is attributing that to the misfire as a cylinder number 1. So that's a pretty cool thing there. We also have, I know somewhere a mode 6 where we can do an actual misfire counter on each cylinder, but that power balance is a pretty cool way of doing it. So now what we want to do is, let's take a look, and first of all, let's find out where cylinder number 1 is on this thing. All right, we have, okay, well, hopefully cylinder number 1 is up front here. And of course, some of you guys who are professional mechanics will almost guaranteed recognize this, and you will know. I do not. I am hoping cylinder number 1 is up front here, because if cylinder number 1 is not up front, it is going to be under the intake manifold, and that is going to make our diagnosis very difficult. So actually it won't. It will make it more difficult, but it won't make it very difficult. We will still be able to diagnose this even if this is on the rear bank. Okay, let's get some data here and find out where this cylinder is. All right, so what I'm going to do is type firing order here. You can also just Google this, but I'm going to use my on-demand here. And if we go to these diagrams here, it should show us a diagram of the engine. It does, and that is going to be a problem. Cylinder number 1 is indeed underneath the intake manifold. Okay, so we've got single cylinder misfire under the intake manifold. We want to try to determine the cause of this issue, A, without removing the intake manifold, and B, determine if we need to remove the intake manifold in order to repair this before I give a quote to the customer. So let's go over the challenge here that I will face even as a do-it-yourselfer. I am doing this work for someone else. I will need to quote them a price. And as a professional mechanic, this is going to be a really special challenge. This is where you're going to lose a customer, and I will explain why. Okay, let's think about this now, because this is a situation that I'm sure a lot of people get themselves in trouble with. So we now know we've got a cylinder under the intake manifold that has an issue. If we were just, grease monkey wrench turners, there's kind of no way around it. We are going to have to remove this intake manifold. It looks to me like that's going to be at least a 3-hour job, removing and reinstalling an intake manifold. So what are our options here? Well, one of them is we tell the customer, you've got a misfire under the intake manifold. We have to charge you a diagnostic fee in order to look at it. We're looking, I don't know, what would a shop charge for an intake manifold? Probably $600, $700, I'm guessing. $600 or $700 just to tell you what's wrong with the car. Now, on top of that, we've got the challenge, what are we going to do when we remove the intake manifold? Because this could be a compression problem, this could be a ignition coil problem, a spark plug problem, it could be a combination of things, could be a fuel injector problem. So what do we do now? Do we take the ignition coils, spark plugs, and injectors from the back, move them to the front, and move the ones in the front to the back, and then put everything back together, run the engine? We now see the misfires in the front of the car, and now we can determine it's either an injector or a coil or a spark plug, and we can more easily fix it. And again, you charge time for that. Or do we say, hey, we've got to go under the intake manifold. We are recommending that as long as we've got to remove the intake manifold, we will need to replace coils and plugs and injectors while we're there. This is after, of course, we confirm this isn't a compression issue in the cylinder. But we need to replace all those. Why? What's the mantra, guys? Do you pay attention on the channel? It needs it anyway. Yep, that's right. That's what you do when you change parts because you don't know what you're doing, or you change parts and it didn't fix the car. Hey, that's all right. Needed it anyway. So now you're going to tell the customer that they need anyway a set of injectors, coils, and plugs. Okay, great. Now, on top of that, here's the real issue. You go ahead and you replace the injectors, coils, plugs, whatever it is you do. You put it all back together, and guess what? The misfire is still there. Why? Because the PCM is fried, because it turned out it was a fried coil. And when the coil shorted out, it fried the driver in the PCM for that coil. So now, on top of all this, you're going to tell the customer that now that we did all this and it was $2,000 worth of work, you now need an engine computer. Hey, it needed it anyway, right? So you see the issue here with how are we going to deal with this and present something that's fair to the customer. By the way, is it fair to the customer that we're going to replace all the coils, all the plugs, all the injectors just because an intake manifold is removed, because we don't know what to do when this misfire is under the intake manifold? Is that fair to replace all those parts because the customer needed it anyway? I don't think so. So what we want to do is we want to determine if this issue requires removal of the intake manifold and see if we can pinpoint the cause with just your 1 hour diagnostic fee. And actually, we're going to do it in well under an hour. So the first thing we want to do is we want to rule out stuff that we can do just right off the bat. One of them would be if there is a compression problem in this engine. So we're just going to go ahead and look for a compression problem really quick. And I'm going to take my microphone here, and we are just going to do an audible test and see if there is indication of a compression issue. All right, we are not about to do 6 hours of work on this car only to find out it still doesn't work afterwards. I don't do that. All right, let's take a listen to this engine while I do a clear flood mode crank. All right, perfect. This is not a compression issue. I am removing that from the list just from that quick test. Okay, while admittedly a little bit subjective, there is no question in my mind, this is not a compression issue. I am not even going in that direction. So what does this leave us with? Well, we could have a fuel issue. We could have an ignition issue, a spark issue. We could also have some type of an intake manifold leak at just cylinder number 1. That is a possibility. We're not going to have a timing issue that would affect multiple cylinders. So there are some things we can also rule out as well. But right now, I'm personally thinking most likely this is going to be an ignition issue, probably failed coil, something like that. But we also need to worry, if it's a failed coil, is it also possible we aren't getting command to the coil? And with this being underneath the intake manifold, yeah, that's a little bit of a challenge because we can't get to the connectors for the coil and do our electrical testing. So we want to kind of maybe put that off a little bit, do some easier things first. One thing that could cause this problem could be if there is an intake manifold leak at cylinder number 1. So let's get the scan tool back up and let's look and see if we can get any evidence that there's a direction there. All right, get this car started up again. Well, one thing we can tell the customer, it's definitely not a fuel pump. That is for sure. It is absolutely not a fuel pump. I think they'll be relieved to know that they were a little worried about that. This is actually kind of an elderly couple. What we're gonna do is we're gonna go to the data stream here, and we're gonna look for any evidence that this could be an intake manifold leak. Okay, and what we're gonna do is, let's pull up our long and short-term fuel trims here. You know what would be a good idea? We would have codes for this if this was an injector issue, but I am going to go ahead and bring up these injector faults just because they're there. There's our long-term trims. We need short-term trims. Just pass them up. There they are. Okay, and there's our data set. I can tell you, I just felt several misfires. and none of the injectors are showing a fault, and I wouldn't expect that. As a matter of fact, I think I'm going to go back here. It's not detecting an injector fault, doesn't mean there isn't one, but it's not detecting one despite these misfires. What I think I'm going to do is pull up just a misfire identifier. Let's just get total number of misfires there. Yeah, we can see here we're stacking up some misfires. There's some more. Okay, just out of curiosity, we got a little bit of a higher long-term fuel trim on bank 1 than on bank 2. Let's see what happens with RPM, and it comes down to about 7. Lid off. Okay, so there is definitely a vacuum leak, for sure. But that is not going to be enough to cause this misfire problem. I am pretty sure of it. Again, let's graph that out. Yeah, vacuum leak all day long. That's not the cause of our misfires, though. For sure. As a matter of fact, we can go ahead and prove that. Just to be safe, let's go back here to our data stream. Let's pull up some oxygen sensor voltage. Bank 1, sensor 1 voltage. That's where our misfire is going to be. And we want bank 2, sensor 1 voltage right there. All right, what we're going to do is I'm going to take a can of brake cleaner. The first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that this test would work. So we are going to spray just a little bit in there. We can see our reaction we get from our O2 sensors there. Okay, so we know we will be able to detect if we have a vacuum leak now. Okay, I've combined these graphs so it's easier to see. And what we're going to look for, going to spray right around this intake manifold runner for number 1. It didn't do anything. Just spraying right around for number 1. There is no change at all. This is not an intake manifold leak at all. You can run this along the front bank of the engines. Yeah, you can see we have nothing. No leaks on the front of the engine either. We saw a little bit of a high fuel trim there as well. So this is definitely not an intake manifold leak. What this does confirm is that at this point, if we were just wrench spinners, this intake manifold is going to need to come off to fix this car. I believe most likely this is going to be an ignition issue. But we also need to be absolutely sure that this is not a PCM issue before we go through taking off an intake manifold. So what we're going to do is I'm going to look here around this car, and I don't see the PCM in the engine bay here. So I'm going to follow the wiring along, and basically the idea is I want to get to the PCM because I want to make sure that there is control to the coil in the injector from the PCM before we remove an intake. And I can see this PCM is going to be in the passenger compartment under the glove box. All right, let me take a look there, but we're not going to do this either. Oh yeah, that's not happening. I'm not crawling under the glove box to get to the PCM. If the PCM was readily available in this engine bay, we would do some tests on the PCM just to make sure we don't replace a bunch of parts only to find out it was a PCM failure. We now need a different strategy here. There are so many ways we can do this, so many ways. What I'm thinking we could do is maybe we could go through the fuse box and we could find the fuse for the ignition, and we could do an amperage test on that circuit and see if we can detect the parade of amperage for all of the coils and verify that we have at least firing of all the coils at the very minimum. And that would be pretty helpful to do. We would also want to do that for the injectors. One issue we could have is very often, while that's a really, really simple and powerful technique and very rapid, if we've got too many other things on that circuit, it becomes just a nightmare figuring that out. And most likely that is going to be the case here. So we want to take a look at a wire diagram and just see if this is even a viable option. Okay, so right here's our wire diagrams, and we can go to our system diagrams here. Engine performance, and let's see if we can find some ignition coils here. Nope. Oh, right there. No, that says fuel injectors down there. Although, I'm going to highlight this power source for the fuel injectors because I kind of have an idea here. There's our ignition coils right there. And this is going to be a problem because the wire that I highlighted also powers our ignition coils here. And that means that the coils and the injectors are going to be on that same circuit. And I can tell you that is going to be really busy to the point that I don't think this is going to be a good strategy. And there may be other things on this circuit as well. Let's go back here and see. Oh yeah, there definitely is, because we branch off this way. To power the mass airflow sensor, I can live with that. That's not going to have high amperage spikes. Oh wow, there's a split right there. That goes to several things. This is all powered from our Fuse 41 here. But the problem is this is not a viable option. The reason being because it's going to be really, really challenging to determine the ignition coils and separate that from the fuel injectors and separate that from whatever else may be on the circuit. I think we are going to abandon this method and we're going to do something a little more direct. All right, time to bring out the diagnostics cart here. And what I'm thinking we're going to do is we are going to try to see if we can use our Pico to detect any activity on the ignition coil at number 1 using a probe. So let's set that up. All right, I believe, we'll start off with about 20 milliseconds per division here. Let's get this car started. All right, what we're going to do is I'm going to use this capacitive pickup probe. Just lay this on this ignition coil right here, and let's verify that we can pick up a signal on our scope. If we look over on our wall here, yeah, we most definitely can. So I need to adjust our time frame and amplitudes here, but there's definitely ignition signal there, no question about it. We need to invert our signal and we will see an ignition pattern. I am very positive. There's one right there. All right, those are ignition signals, no doubt about it. A little finicky with this probe. It's not my favorite thing. There we go. Okay, so there's some good clean ignition signals. This is on a known good coil. I know a lot of you guys that have seen my previous videos on this, you're saying these are really weird. This is a thing with Ford where you get 3 firings per cylinder. It's kind of a weird thing. But this is a typical, for this era, a typical ignition signal for this Ford. And trying to keep this probe on here. There we go. Okay, that looks nice and stable. Okay, during that whole time, there was probably a dozen misfires or so. They didn't reflect on that particular coil, so we know that this test is going to work pretty good. So now what I want to do is this. I may be able to go through here. It looks more like actually I can definitely reach the whole back row if I move the power steering reservoir. So I'm going to remove this power steering reservoir and be right back. Okay, just moving that power steering reservoir out of the way. This allows me to get my probe in here. Oh, easy. I could actually test all the coils this way. Where is that ignition coil? There it is, right there. Let's go look at our screen. Oh, cool, I can just leave that right there and we can look at our screen. And there we go. And I can tell you right now, this is an ignition problem. We are done. This is going to be an ignition coil failure. Just looking at that, I'm going to prove it in a second. Undeniably, give me a minute here. I'm going to put some load on the engine, and we're going to see these go even more haywire. Right there. Yep. Yeah, that ignition coil is not working. And we are done with our diagnosis. That's it. All right, how easy was that? So what do you think? $100 bucks? 100 bucks? I'll take $100 for that. Honestly, if I wasn't filming, I probably just from experience would have started with the ignition coils. Just the way that that feels like an ignition misfire, totally subjective. I would have started with this, and 15 minutes at tops 15 minutes, I would have had this diagnosis done. But think of this from a customer perspective. They know there's a diagnostic fee. My diagnostic fee, I call them before they even get their Uber back home. I can tell them exactly what the quote is. We need to quote for where we're going to give them an option. I can fix this car, and we can replace the ignition coil, but because the ignition coil has failed, by the way, we know this isn't a computer problem either. We saw there's command to the coil. So we can just replace the ignition coil. That also involves the labor with the intake manifold and the gaskets and all that stuff. I'm going to very strongly recommend that they replace all the spark plugs in the car, because most likely it's spark plug wear that caused the coil failure, and we want to prevent this in the future. I'm also going to give them the option of, at the very minimum, replacing the 2 other ignition coils in the rear of the engine, as long as I've got the intake manifold off. So replacing just the rear bank of coils at the very minimum, given the fact that the age of the coils is equivalent, and there's every reason to think the other coils could be soon to failure as well. And therefore we prevent having to do another intake manifold job if another coil fails. I will also give the option of replacing all 6 coils, but I'm going to remind them that if a coil failure occurs at the front of the engine, I literally could replace that in 10 minutes for like $100 while they wait. So those are the options that I can give this customer and make $100 for really, 20 minutes of work? I know for 100% fact this ignition coil is going to fix the car. As a matter of fact, I'll prove it, because I'm going to go ahead and replace the coil after I call the customer. So let me call Barbara up and see what her and her husband want to do. Okay, so after talking with Barbara and her husband, again, these are some elderly people on a fixed income. They've already put a ton of money trying to build up this car that they got used, and it kind of turned out to be a little bit of a lemon. But what we're going to do is we are going to replace the plugs all around the car. We are going to replace the 3 ignition coils underneath the intake, and of course replace the intake manifold gaskets and all that. And this car will be fixed, and I know that I can hold to my quote, and I'm not going to come back to them with my tail between my legs thinking of some way I'm going to make an excuse for how I misdiagnosed the car. No, not going to happen. I know 100% certain this will fix it. I know 100% certain how much it's going to cost, and so do my customers. All right, let's get this ignition coil replaced, and then we will be back to show the final fix. Okay, we're going to do a little test here. I'm going to take my bad coil that I've marked with the orange tape, take one of these good coils. Let's do a ohms test on the bench, see if we can find any evidence that the coil is bad here. Okay, this is a horribly unreliable way to test a coil, but if we notice a difference here that's significant, that'll be valid. But if we don't notice a difference versus a good coil, it means nothing. The coil still can be bad. I see all the time that these coils pass the ohm test, but they're bad because we're not testing under load. It's a totally different thing when the coil's under load. Okay, so we're reading about 0.8 ohms on the primary there. Let's check our secondary. Okay, and we've got about 5,500 ohms on the secondary. So 0.8, 5.5. Let's compare that with a known good coil from the front of the car. Okay, we read just about the same 0.8 ohms on that primary on the good coil. And boy, it's exactly the same. It's about 5.5 kilo ohms on the secondary. Okay, so by that you would say that I made the wrong call and this coil is not the issue, but I can tell you that the scope is far, far, far more reliable than the ohm meter on this, and this coil is definitely bad. We will actually prove it, not only when we fix the car
But of course, somebody's going to say, well, you didn't do anything different than what you complained to some people do because you just replaced everything under the intake manifold. And I would agree, that's true. But what we will do at the end of the video, once we verify the fixes, I will put this coil back into the front of the engine, and we will see that the misfires will follow this coil. And that will be our evidence. All right, let me get back to the car. We'll finish this up and see that it works.
All right, let's get going here. Oh, we got our parts jackpot, except we win every time on this jackpot. Got everything buttoned up here. Let's get into the car, start this up, and verify our fix. Okay, actually, since this menu just came up, let's go ahead and clear our faults and verify that. Okay, and all we have is the P1000, which means we've cleared the faults and reset the memory. Okay, so, whoops, we already did that. We want to go back to wherever that power balance was. And I remember that was in special functions, power balance. Okay, let's go ahead and start up this car. Starts right up. No misfires so far. Okay, let's put the car in drive. And yeah, this car is fixed. You can feel it. No more misfires. We are done, except for one more thing we have to do here. We're gonna go ahead and put that bad coil in just to prove that I was correct, that the only thing this car really needed to actually fix the symptom was a coil. And if the customer was on an extreme budget, you'll notice the coils in front are still the original ones. If it was my car, I would have replaced them, but I'm definitely in a different financial situation than this customer is. I do have a lot of customers for sure that even just another $100 is a big deal to them. So we just want to show that we could have fixed this just with only this bad coil if the customer's budget only allowed for that, and we would still be confident this car will be fixed. Okay, I don't even remember, was this numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 1, 2, 3, 4? So either number 2 or number 4 is gonna light up misfires, and then we know for sure it was only the coil, as I said. Okay, well, we're idling pretty decent. Well, we're getting misfires, actually, as you can see. Now at cylinder number 4, just here in idle right now. So that's all we need to do. That conclusively proves the coil was our issue. We moved our misfire along with the coil. So that is a conclusive evidence that only the coil was really the problem on this car. All right, that's how you keep busy every single weekend, is fixing a car for less than the cost than some shops would diagnose the issue for, and even then possibly diagnose it incorrectly and still charge you. So hopefully you enjoyed that, and I hope you found this helpful. We will see you next time.